Thanks for all hanging around. It's after that last talk, I think it's time to dumb things down a bit, and I'm just the man for the job, really, because I'm just a sports jock. You know, I'm just a sports medicine doctor, and we're not real doctors. We don't deal with real disease. We just try and keep athletes on the park. But what I want to talk about today is 4 different topics. I want to take you through my low-carb journey. I want to talk very briefly, summarise the effects of low-carb on health and the effects on performance. And I want to finish by talking a little bit about the politics of how we can achieve our aims in worldwide dominance of low-carb. So I thought I'd start with my low, and I'm sorry to be self-indulgent, but it's a fairly typical story, I think, of a middle-aged person who goes low-carb. So I've always been interested in nutrition. I co-authored the first Australian book on sports nutrition back in the 1980s called Food for Sport. But to be honest, I got a bit bored with sports nutrition. I mean, because for 20, 30 years, all it was carbs and carbs and carb loading for marathons and more carbs and carbs for recovery and carbs during events and then a bit of some fluids and, you don't wait till you're thirsty, you drink, and that was it. So, I sort of lost a bit of interest, to be honest. And so that was until 2012. And I just turned 60. I know you find that hard to believe, but I just turned 60. And I was overweight. I'd probably gained a pound a year for the previous 30 years. That is despite, following all the nutritional guidelines, low fat. So I'd have low fat milk and low fat this and low fat that. I was very conscientious, and yet despite that, I'd put on probably 15 kilograms, 30 pounds over that period of time. And I was 93 kilograms. I don't know what that is in pounds, but it's a lot. And as you can see, I look about, 5 months pregnant there. My kids have started to sort of poke me in the belly and say, Dad, come on, do something. And I sort of said, well, guys, I'm doing all the right things. I was exercising, and despite that, I was still getting to become obese. And then in 2012, I saw a statement by this guy, Tim Noakes. Tim's an old friend of mine. We've shared conference platforms for probably 20 or 30 years. And he's someone I'd always really admired his intellect. Tim's always someone who challenged the norm, and previously he'd been proven correct on a number of occasions. So when Tim came out, not the normal way people come out, but came out, and I don't want to spread rumours, he's very happily. When Tim came out in 2012 and said that, instead of, that everything he'd been saying about carbs for the last 30 years was wrong, and that we should be, low carb, I really sort of was shocked. I mean, Tim wrote The Law of Running. Any runners in the room would have read that. It's the Bible of running. And in it, he talks a lot about carbs and the importance of carbs and so on. And all of a sudden, this guy who's sort of the king of carbs, if you like, has come around and said, no, I was wrong. And that both for his personal experience and from others, that he'd changed his mind, and he thought that carbs were in fact detrimental, and he'd developed type 2 diabetes himself, and he was feeling terrible, and he transformed his life by reducing carbs. And I thought, whoa, boy, that's a big one. I think as Tim finally lost it, as he finally sort of, all those carbs really got to him. So I thought, no, let's think about that. I mean, Tim, as I said, is someone whose intellect I'd really admired. So I thought, well, I need to go and investigate this. So I went and bought a book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, Gary Taubes. I'm sure most of you have read it. In England, it was called The Diet Delusion, and the sort of dumbed-down version is We Get Fat. But I read that book, and I just couldn't believe it. Every night I would go to bed and shaking my head and say, no, this could not be true. We couldn't have got this wrong for 30 years. It really just it disturbed me. I mean, it was quite a disturbing read to read this book. There's a fascinating thing about the book was that not only did it sort of talk about the science or non-science of low fat and low carb, but it talked about the politics, explained why the low fat movement, I guess, had become dominant, had won out over the low carb movement back in the 70s and 80s. It was a fascinating book, and it just blew me away. I'd never read a book that had such an impact on me in my time. So thank you very much, Gary Taubes. But so I got to the end of that, and that had a desire to read more, so I read every book I could get my hands on and every article. I must have read hundreds of papers and so on. And the more I read, the more I got convinced that, you know, maybe we have been wrong for all this time. And I thought, well, the next thing to do is research. You know, I'm always big on research. And I decided to do an experiment. And this experiment was an n=1, which most scientists would say is absolutely useless, except when the 1 is you. And in that case, I decided the 1 was going to be me. And I would experiment on myself and I would go low carb. So, which I did. And I did all the things that you're all very familiar with, stopped all the other rice and bread and grains and pasta and so on, and ate lots of green veg and salmon and all those things, and the odd glass of red wine there that snuck into the photo. I don't know how that got there. Well, there's lots of good things in red wine, you know, there's resveratrol, anyway. So I did that for 13 weeks, and at the end of that, at 13 weeks, I was half the man I used to be. I'd lost, I'd lost 28 pounds in 13 weeks. And I felt fantastic. My appetite had diminished remarkably. I was eating, so previously, you know, I'd have my normal sort of cereal and things for breakfast, and by, you know, 11:30 I'd be sort of looking at my watch saying, God, it must be lunchtime soon. Whereas now I didn't even have lunch. So I'd lost my appetite. My exercise capacity had increased. I felt I was able to do more exercise, and all in all, I felt really good. So what about you know, my research, my bloods? Well, September the 15th was when I started, the day before I started, and December the 17th was the sort of the 3 months up was up. And then I repeated my bloods in May. And this is very typical, and I'm sure you've seen this all in your practices. My total cholesterol was, if anything, slightly higher. My HDL was a little bit higher. My LDL was higher. My triglycerides went down dramatically. And I believe the most important component of lipids is your triglyceride-HDL ratio. I don't take too much notice of total cholesterol or even LDL. But the trig-HDL ratio, I think, is the key. And mine went from 2.13 to 1.13. So I was pretty happy with that. I felt my cardiovascular risk had significantly diminished as a result of that diet. Now, interestingly enough, I had previous blood tests that I'd chosen to ignore, but they'd shown a fatty liver. And these results here in 2005, 7, 11 were just from routine blood tests for other reasons. And they'd shown elevated liver enzymes, your gamma-GT and your ALT in particular. And that is very indicative of fatty liver. And I remember reading the report, you know, down the bottom, it said, you know, suggestive of fatty liver, and typical doctor, I totally ignored it and sort of pushed it to the back of my mind and pretended that that wasn't happening because I didn't have fatty liver. I didn't really know what fatty liver was anyway. I told you, I'm dumbed down. I'm a doctor, a sports doctor. But in 2013, I wasn't even really thinking about it. But because the blood test sort of showed up next to the previous one, I suddenly realised that my fatty liver had disappeared. And I wasn't even trying. And you know, I ate all this fat and my fatty liver disappeared. And it was really messing with my head, I tell you. So in 3 months of low carb, high fat, I'd lost 28, 29 pounds of weight. I'd a reduced appetite. I'd increased my HDL, my good cholesterol. I'd decreased significantly my triglycerides, improved my triglyceride-HDL ratio. My fatty liver had resolved. That's not a bad package, is it? The only problem was I had to get a new wardrobe. But, you know, that's a price you have to pay. No, don't applaud, because, you know, you should criticise me for being dumb enough to have got that fat in the first place. But anyway, that's okay. And so following that, you know, I then became very interested. Tim Noakes then brought out his book, Real Meal Revolution, and then Nina Teicholz, who I think is probably the best book of all. I'll always be indebted to Gary Taubes' book, but I think Nina's actually probably an even better book, and that's certainly the best book I've read on the topic, and I'll come back to that book later on. And so, you know, I've read everything I could possibly get my hands on. I even became a movie star in Serial Killers and with Tim Noakes. And I was fortunate enough to meet up with Rod and be invited to speak at some of his low-carb down under seminars. And we'd run out of people in Australia to bore, so he brought me over here to bore you lot. So, and I put a little, people kept saying, oh, you're going to write a book, you're going to write a book. And I said, I can't possibly write books as well as some of the people who are out there, but I have got a little sort of pamphlet that I've written on. So you want to know about low carb, high fat. Okay, so enough about me. So what about the effects on health? Okay, now again, I'm not going to, I'm preaching to the converted here, and that many of you are already aware of this. So I'll just whip through some of this because there may be one or two of you are new to this game. So I believe that there are three modern epidemics. We keep hearing about, Ebola and all other fancy diseases, but really, the serious epidemics are these three: obesity, type 2 diabetes, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And what I'll propose to show you now is that they're all related. Obesity, well, you've all seen the graphs of, and you can do this in every country. Americans are getting heavier, significantly heavier, both men and women, and the rate continues to climb. About a third, and then the figures are very similar for Australia. We follow all your good habits. So it's about a third obese, a third overweight, and a third normal weight. And that's not a great percentage, and incredibly expensive. I mean, the cost to the community of obesity is massive. And kids, I mean, we never used to see. I remember at school, I was trying to think the other day. There was one fat kid at school. We called him Fatty. That was imaginative. I mean, he's a friend of mine. Who subsequently, he's fine and he lost weight and so on. But the point of that is that he was so unusual, that we called him Fatty. I mean, nowadays, every second kid is Fatty, and probably, parents will sue you if you call them Fatty or something like that. But anyway, and look, the United States leads the medal tally in Olympics and leads the world in many things, and you'll be pleased to know that you lead the world in the prevalence of overweight children as well, so congratulations. and that's steadily increasing as well. Well done. And as Yang said in JAMA recently, this generation of Americans is the first that will have a shorter life expectancy. That is scandalous. I mean, all of modern technology and everything we know, and the wonderful things that medicine can do now, and this generation is going to have a shorter life expectancy than the previous one. That is a scandal. Why? Well, what happened? What happened to make that graph start going up? Well, something happened, 30 years ago, and for reasons that we won't necessarily go into, that Gary and Nina have explained very well, that we decided that fat was bad, and we decided that low fat was the way to go, and we were very good at doing that. We maintained it ourselves, so on, and we brought in these guidelines. Now pyramids are wonderful things, but this pyramid has done a lot of damage, and it needs to fall down much quicker than the other pyramids fell down. Or going to fall down. So we were very good at following those low-fat guidelines. You look at all the changes, and we did what we were told. We did reduce the amount of fat intake. The only problem is, of course, the food companies being very clever, they realised that when they responded very well. The food industry was fantastic, Take all the fat out? Sure, we'll take all the fat out. They took all the fat out of food, and they suddenly realised, oh shit, there's no flavour left in the food. What are we going to do about that? Aha, I know what we'll do. We'll just pump sugar in instead. But we won't call it sugar. We'll call it other things. They're very clever. So that's what they did. And 30 years ago, we swapped fat for sugar, basically. And now we have incredible amounts of sugar in all our sodas. And I like to sort of think about teaspoons of sugar, because no one really understands calories and mils and ounces and grams and all that sort of stuff. So let's just talk about teaspoons of sugar, and it's pretty scary. And sauce, I mean, okay, we all sort of get it that soda drinks might have sugar in them, but sauces and things like that, sugar is everywhere. 70% of processed foods have added sugar, and as for Starbucks, well, we won't go there. Now, this is interesting. This is Australian figures, okay? So the top 5 checkout items in the major supermarket in Australia, leaving aside alcohol and cigarettes, which is a comment in itself. Number 1 was Coca-Cola, a 300 small bottle. Next one was a 24-pack. Next one was a 30-pack. Somehow milk snuck in there. And the next one was 2 litre bottle of Coke, and the next one was a 1 litre bottle of Coke. 4 of the top 5. Congratulations, Coca-Cola. Well done. Your shareholders are very happy. As I said, they kept putting sugar in things, but they never called it sugar. And there are 56 different names. There's probably more since we did that slide for sugar, and it's everywhere. And you've got to, you can look at a label and say, oh gosh, good, hasn't got any sugar in it. No. Okay, well, can we lose weight? Well, we can't just do it by running. And there's a very good article by Asim Malhotra, who's a British cardiologist, who I'm sure you've all read, and Tim and Steve Finney, and showed that you can't just outrun a bad diet. The most important, there are many reasons to exercise, don't get me wrong, there are huge benefits of exercise, but one of them is probably not a really strong benefit to weight. So we need to sort of change the pyramid around a little bit. Now, just looking at the number of studies, and again, there's been more since I put this slide together, but let's have a look at 23 studies comparing weight loss with a low-fat and a low-carb diet. And yes, you do lose weight on a low-fat diet, certainly. Let's not kid ourselves. Low-fat diets are effective. They're not nearly as effective as low-carb diet, and they're unsustainable, unlike a low-carb diet. So there's 2 fairly important factors, but they are effective. But again, not nearly, in every single study, the low-carb diet was more effective than the low-fat diet as far as weight loss goes. Okay, let's move on to diabetes. There are other people in the audience, Eric and others, who know far more about diabetes than I do. But just quickly, there are 105 million Americans with diabetes or pre-diabetes. In the world, it's gone up from 30 million to 415, and I think that's a very conservative estimate. Diabetes, obesity, and the metabolic syndrome are starting to overtake communicable diseases as major threats to health worldwide. Prevalence rates of diabetes and obesity are rising sharply. That article was in The Lancet, one of the world's most reputable journals. Diabetes rate, up it goes, similar to the obesity rate. That's a coincidence. And the cost, in the UK, they're predicting within 10 years, the cost of treating diabetes alone will be the same as the whole health budget at the moment. Think about that. We're bankrupting our countries. We won't be able to provide healthcare within 10 or 15 years if we keep going the way we are. Yet the current treatment protocols, insulin, drugs, low-fat diets are clearly not effective enough. We need to look at other possibilities. And most of you will have read this very excellent review by Richard Feynman, which summarises very well the efficacy of low-carb diets in the management of diabetes. And there's no doubt that low-carb diet should be the first port of call in the treatment of diabetes. Now, what about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? It doesn't get as much publicity as the other things. It's characterised by an accumulation of fat in the liver with or without inflammation, fibrosis and cirrhosis in the absence of substantial alcohol consumption. So for years we've worried about alcoholic liver disease, liver cirrhosis. Well, here we are, we're having the same thing occur without any alcohol, with just high carbohydrate intake. It now affects 20 to 30% of adults in the developed world, and yet most of us don't know it. Or if we have blood tests that show it, we just ignore it. And it can progress to other liver problems. It can also be found to increase overall cardiovascular. But the interesting thing is it seems to be a precursor. So there's a wonderful expression by Professor Taylor in 2013. Before the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, there is a long, silent scream from the liver. So in other words, a fatty liver is probably one of the early signs that you're failing to cope with the carbohydrate load and that you're heading towards metabolic syndrome and diabetes. So an important factor. And just remind you of my results, and that's very typical of what happens. Completely resolved in the space of 3 months on a low-carb diet. All right, just briefly, you're all aware of the effects of low-carb on cardiac risk factors. And the fact that every meta-analysis and review shows that there is no association of saturated fat with cardiovascular disease. You still cannot convince any dietitian or any cardiologist of that, but the facts are there in the literature. Blood tests are not always that relevant. And again, comparing the two diets, the low-carb and low-fat diets, HDL cholesterol. These are a summary of all the different studies. And again, you can see that the blue, which is the low carb, has a better, more positive effect for increasing the HDL. Remember, the higher the HDL, the better, than a low-fat diet. And certainly with triglycerides, the lower the triglyceride, the better, and low carb is much more proficient. So I think, it's very clear what the most effective diet is. And of course, statins. The amount of money being spent on statins in my country and yours is absolutely ridiculous, and all it does is give you 3 extra days of life. That's quoting a reputable medical journal in England. The Beckhams are set to buy, but statins add a mere 3 days to your life. Okay. All right, there are lots of other things. I just want to tell you a little story. I look after the Australian cricket team, and so they're very elite. Cricket's a funny old sport that we inherited from the Palmers, but it's incredibly boring, and you guys wouldn't be interested in it. It's even more boring than baseball, which is hard to believe. But we play for 5 days and sometimes don't even get a result, so that's okay. That's sort of an English thing, anyway. Okay. Anyway, one of our very best cricketers, I was on tour with him in India in 2013, and he'd had a history of knee pain. In fact, he'd had to take a year off his cricket because of his knee pain. And he was struggling. He was playing again, but wasn't able to train fully. He was unfit. The coaches were on his back because he wasn't fit enough, and so on. So the story about his knee pain is that he'd had this knee pain. No one could work out what was wrong with him. He'd had all sorts of tests and arthroscopies and so on. Finally, he saw a rheumatologist who said, "You've got seronegative arthritis," which, for those of you who don't, it's similar to rheumatoid, but it's not exactly the same, but similar sort of concept. So they started him on some pretty heavy-duty drugs, as you do. He started on prednisolone and methotrexate, pretty strong, marginal improvement. Then they moved him on to Enbrel, which is a anti-tumour necrosis factor drug. I think you have that here. Very expensive drug, 15,000 Australian. It's probably about 2 million American. He was coping okay on Enbrel. He was having fortnightly injections of Enbrel, and he said to me on day 10 or 11 of that fortnight, my knee starts to ache, and I know it's time to have my Enbrel. Well, as I said, I was with him on tour in India, and he'd been on the previous tour, and in between the 2 tours is when I'd lost my weight. And he said, "Oh, Doc, well done, nudge, good job. You've lost all that weight. How'd you do it?" And he was very curious because he was a little bit overweight himself. And he came up to you a little while later and said, "Look, I'd like to try the diet." So he went seriously low carb, did it very conscientiously, and 3 weeks later came up to me and said, "Doc, I forgot to take my Enbrel last week. I didn't have any knee pain. Do you think I should take it?" I said, "Oh, just wait and see how you go." Well, that was February 2013, and he's had 1 dose of Enbrel since. He had 1 episode of pain after he'd been on a flight for about 14 hours, and he's not taken a single drug since then. And his cricket has progressed to the point where he's now in the top 10 batsmen in the world. And so, that it shows. It shows the effect. Again, I tell that to rheumatologists, and they just don't believe me, and they refuse to believe you because it's not in their paradigm. We need drugs. The interesting thing is, many of you have been to medical school. Okay, now. Hands up those who had a subject in their medical degree called surgery. Okay, hands up those who had a subject in their medical degree called pharmacology, or Okay, hands up those who had a subject in their medical degree called nutrition. Oh, gee, I can't even remember a single lecture on nutrition. So it's no wonder that doctors don't know anything about this. We all like to be in our comfort zone, don't we? And nutrition is way out of most doctors' comfort zone. So how do we cope with something's out of our comfort zone? We reject it. Okay, enough boring philosophy. All right, so, positive effect on all these things: weight, diabetes, liver disease, cardiovascular risk factors, inflammation, and, there's a huge, inflammation is everywhere. I won't even talk about other, there are other possible things. I'm, pretty convinced that there's links with cancer, with Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, a whole irritable bowel, a whole range of diseases. But I don't say that in front of doctors because, we don't have evidence, or we don't have complete evidence yet. but I think that will all come out over the next few years. So, I think it's pretty convincing, isn't it? Okay, so let's quickly talk about performance, and Pete did a fantastic job this morning about talking about that, so I'm not going to repeat what he said. He showed very clearly that this is one of his runners, Tim Olson, who held that 100-mile record that he was talking about, and the CrossFit guys. It's very clear that a low-carb diet is beneficial for endurance, ultra-endurance exercise. Now, not all of us run 100 miles every day, but those who do, it's clearly the case. Now, this is not exactly something new. Well, it is new to most of us, but to one person in this room, it's not new. And what year was this, Steve? 1983? Half of you weren't even born. None of the women in the room were even born then, were they? I mean, Steve Finney wrote this in 1983, 33 years ago. And, I'm not going to steal Steve's thunder. He's talking later in the conference. But we're very, privileged to have you here, Steve, because, you're 30 years ahead of your time, and you've suffered as a result. That paper you'd probably argue, was the biggest mistake you ever made, because ever since then, Steve was ostracised by the scientific community. He didn't get any grants, he didn't get any promotions, and it's really only been in the last couple of years that Steve has been welcomed back, at least by our group, if not by medicine in general. So we all owe you an incredible debt. I know I'm going to embarrass him now, but we all owe Steve an incredible And Steve, in 10 years' time, when they decide they need to award a Nobel Prize for the biggest change in human nutrition in this century, I hope you'll be one of the people who get it, mate. That's for sure. Okay, many of you will have read Volek and Finney's, that's the Bible, if you like, on the effect of low carb on performance. I would thoroughly recommend that to you. And a couple of papers that that's a pretty good trio, isn't it? Noakes, Volek and Finney. Anything they wrote, you've got to read that. And that's also a very good review in the European Journal of Sports Science. For those of you interested in the whole fuel for endurance exercise, I thoroughly recommend that paper, and congratulations to Steve and his co-authors on that. But what about other sports? Now, we talked a little bit this morning about the high-intensity sports, okay? The basketball, the soccer, the rugby, the ones that require intermittent bursts of high activity. I mean, are they going to be helped by a low-carb diet? Well, there's certainly lots of examples of, in basketball, the biggest names. Dr. Shanahan was who's speaking here at the conference was very involved with the Lakers and reducing their carb intake. I had to bring the Australian current NBA champion into that anyway. And your own football, of course, and even the big guys are realising there's some benefits to this. And we're in a skiing environment, and certainly the US has two legendary skiers of both low carbers. So there's this is a great book, Novak Djokovic. Any of you, the #1 tennis player in the world, arguably of all time. His whole life and his tennis changed when he changed his diet. And it's a fascinating book to read. And even golfers, you think, well, golfers, they're all a bit, But, even golfers have benefited from the weight loss associated with a low-carb diet. Now, there's huge problems with all the research, and I could go through all the research in sport, in performance and low carb, but there's lots of issues, and it's very hard to wade through it, and most of it is very poor quality research. So that still needs to be done, but people are talking with their feet, if you like, and they're all adopting this diet. So it certainly enables athletes to lose weight without losing strength, and that's very important for many athletes to improve their power to weight ratio. It's a huge thing in athletes. So if they can do that, that's a great advantage. We talked a little bit this morning about recovery, the reduction in inflammation as a result of exercise when you're on a low-carb diet makes a huge difference to recovery. And as Pete mentioned, recovery is probably the single biggest thing we talk about in sport and sports medicine at the moment, because the importance of recovering and being able to train again straight after you exercise is so important. Now, Louise Burke's name was mentioned this morning, a very prominent Australian dietitian who's always been incredibly anti this whole low-carb thing. In fact, she got up at a lecture last year and said that Tim Noakes and Peter Brukner should be in jail which I thought was very friendly. I felt like asking her, "Will you come and visit me?" But bring me some avocado or something. But it's interestingly, she's sort of slowly, she's obviously sort of realised that, what she was talking is rubbish. And she's sort of slowly coming around. So her latest thing is, why don't we train low, compete high? And there is quite a lot of sense in that. And Pete alluded to it this morning about training in a low-carb state where you train your fat oxidation system and maximise it, get that working and relying on that. And then for competition days, maybe adding some carbohydrates for the actual event, either the night before or during the race or whatever. And a lot of people find that advantageous. There are certainly people on low-carb diets who say, yeah, but look, when I need to sprint, cycle up that hill or sprint finish or something, I don't quite have the burst that I think I should, and maybe those people need to have some carbs on board. So if I want to summarise, it's clearly good for health. We know that. It's good for ultra-endurance athletes. It's a little bit unclear as to whether it's good for more intense exercise. I think it's a very individual thing that it probably varies from individual to individual. So is it for everyone? Someone asked this morning, is a ketogenic diet for everyone? Well, I'm not sure. I don't think it's necessary for everyone. Probably everyone is going to be healthier on it, but I don't think it's necessary for everyone. Probably every person has an optimal level of carbohydrate intake, and that depends really on their degree of insulin resistance. So if you're severely, significantly insulin resistant, if you're Tim Noakes and your blood sugars are going up and you have all the indicators of insulin resistance, then yes, a low carb, ketogenic diet is certainly the diet for you. I'd very strongly recommend that. If you're many older people. So in young people, the majority are reasonably insulin sensitive. There are a group that are insulin resistant. In people of my age and middle age, most of us are gradually becoming more and more insulin resistant. But there are some who are still very insulin sensitive, who can eat whatever they like and remain skinny and healthy and so on. So, it's probably not as important for the insulin sensitive people to be on a low carb diet, but because they seem to metabolise carbs very well. But the interesting thing is, and athletes are a classic example, what about years and years of high carbohydrate intake? Carb loading and Gatorades and Powerades and carbs and carbs and carbs and carbs for a sporting career of 10, 20, 30 years. What effect is that going to have long term? Is the pancreas going to eventually say, oh, God, give us a break, I'm exhausted. Sorry, I can't give you any more insulin, So that may well be a factor. I think anecdotally, I think a lot of retired athletes develop type 2 diabetes. I don't know whether that's your experiences, Peter and Steve and so on, but we need to do some studies on that. But I suspect that may well be the reason. I'm getting the wind up here. I've got to talk about politics. Just finish with politics, the politics of speaking over your time. Okay. Okay. So it's very obvious to us, isn't it, that low carb is the way to go. And yet that's what, the medical profession is saying. So, if the evidence, to all of us is so obvious, I mean, that's what, makes me, I lie awake at night worrying about this. It's so bloody obvious that, carbs are bad for us and we need to reduce them. How come everyone else can't see that? Well, there are a number of reasons, and there are a number of impediments, okay? Unfortunately, the first impediment is the medical profession. And I alluded to that earlier about their lack of nutrition knowledge, lack of understanding, their general conservatism. There's a wonderful expression that says 50% of everything we get taught in medical school is wrong. You just have to work out which 50%. Well, they're still struggling to work out that one of it is nutrition and so on. So we're very conservative. We're very reluctant to change. We're very much in this drug and surgery paradigm, this disease model. The model of we wait till people get sick and then we try and fix them, rather than stopping them getting sick in the first place. We've got to replace the disease model with the health model. Dietitians, well, with due respect to the dietitians here, are obviously, enlightened. The dietitians are very negative about low carb. And look, in a way, I can understand it. If you've been preaching something for 30 years and some clown of a doctor in South Africa gets up and says, you're wrong, your natural reaction is going to be to resist that. And it takes a bit of courage to admit that we have been wrong. And I'm certainly happy to. It horrifies me, the advice I've given to some patients over the years, and I apologise to all of them. But you've got to admit sometimes that you're wrong, and you've got to change. Be prepared to change, and the dietitians need to do that, and they need to do it fast, or they'll become totally irrelevant. The food industry obviously has a huge vested interest in maintaining the status quo. But as I said, they adapted very well to low fat. Okay, they put sugar in, but they adapted, and I think they'll adapt very well to low carb. We've just got to convince them that's the way to go. The agriculture is particularly an issue in this country. I think that's one of the reasons why the next one, the politicians, are so reluctant to take this on. But Rongan stole my thunder a little bit. Thanks, mate. Bloody pom. But because I think what's happened is that the public is confused a bit because there's so many different terminologies in different diets. There's low carb, there's paleo, there's Mediterranean, there's Atkins, there's Dukan, there's low GI, etc., etc. There's another 50 different diets, and we're sending mixed messages out the whole time. And I agree with Rongan that the public is confused. I think, they want to know, is fat good or bad? Is dairy okay? What about meat? Can I eat fruit? What about fruit juice? What about whole grain? Which yogurt is best? I mean, these are the questions that I get asked, and people keep telling me, I'm confused. I don't know what I should be eating. For 30 years, I felt quite comfortable. I've been bloody unhealthy, but I've been quite comfortable. Now you're confusing me. Stop it. And, I think that's a major problem. And so I have a suggestion. Okay? The one thing that we all agree on, even the dietitians agree on, is sugar. Okay? Everyone agrees that sugar is a major problem, sugar overload. Okay, so why don't we just focus on sugar as the low-hanging fruit? Excuse the fructose pun, but what I'm trying to do is, and this is where we get our sugar from. You're familiar with, the soft drinks, and it's fruit yogurts, and it's the breakfast cereals, and it's biscuits and buns and pastries and so on, and sugar, all that sort of stuff. And good old Coke. I don't like to pick on Coke, but, it's bad. So at the moment, the average Australian, let's talk about teaspoons, because that's, there's different currencies and so on. Let's talk about teaspoons. The average Australian intake of added sugar, not natural sugars, but added sugars, 25 teaspoons a day. Okay? You think, wow, that's a lot. No, it's only a bottle of Coke. Big bottle. The WHO, their upper limit recommended is 12, which is 10% of your overall calories. Their ideal limit is 6. Okay? So what I'm suggesting is something that's called sugar by half. Okay? So to reduce the daily intake of added sugar by 50%, say from 25 at the moment to 12, that upper limit of the, I know my maths is not quite right, but that upper limit of the WHO recommendation. So not even getting down to their ideal. In 5 years, okay, that would have a massive impact on the health of my country and your countries. And how could we do that? Well, education, particularly children. I mean, our generation, we're probably a lost cause, but our kids are not. And they're the important ones in this deal. So school canteen, education of kids, school canteens, hospital food, vending machines, nutrition guidelines. I mean, come on. How much more evidence do they need to change the guidelines? Food labelling, really important. We need to start putting the amount of sugar. We need to put a little teaspoon with the number of teaspoons of sugar, a number in it, on every item of processed food. Because people don't understand about calories and grams and things like that. Everyone knows how much a teaspoon of sugar is. Health warnings. People say, waste of time. No one takes any notice of them. People do take notice of them, and they're a message. They're a sign that the government and others agree that something should be done. And taxation's another one. Now, I do my own little thing. I order 10 copies of the Big Fat Surprise every couple of months, and I give them out to every doctor who says they'll read it. So anyone I'm talking to about diet, any medical person, I say, will you read a book? And they all say yes, because, it's not cool to say they wouldn't read a book. They're intelligent doctors, And they all say yes. Sucked you in. And and I give them a copy of Big Fat Surprise. I keep some in my car, and that's my contribution to the medical fraternity. Every single doctor who's read it so far has come to me later on and said, that's an incredible book, that's changed the way I live and how I practice. So I'm not saying that's the only book around. I think that's the best book, but there are other excellent books around as well. But that's my little contribution to my fellow medical professionals. Taxation is another issue. We could talk about that for ages. One country in the world, Mexico, has put in a soda tax. It's had a significant result, reduction in soda intake and so on. So diet, as we all know, I don't want to pretend that diet is the only part. This is just for my New Zealand friends because this is Australia winning the World Cup cricket earlier in the year. So, you're pretty special, I mean, there are two people in the whole slide just for you, okay? I've lost the rugby one for some reason, but anyway. And these are my essentials for healthy living, the 6 S's, okay? Yes, sugar. We've got to avoid sedentary behaviour. No smoking, no stress, good sleep, good sun. They're the keys to it all. I worry about my profession and where they're going, but I'll close with a lovely quote by an American, by a chap by the name of Wendell Berry. People are fed by the food industry, which pays no attention to health, and are treated by the health industry, which pays no attention to food. Thank you very much.